If you caught the episode before this one, then you already know the simple and surprising way to actually make the content that you share on your podcast 10 times more valuable to your listeners. In this episode, I'm answering a listener question about how to actually measure whether your listeners are getting value from your content, so that you can either A, know whether all that time and energy that you pour into creating episodes is actually paying off, or B, pinpoint exactly whatever it is you need to tweak. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy.
Hey, Courtney. This is Dr. Annie Campanile from Heal Your Trauma, Find Your Voice. I have a question for you. How can I assess whether my content holds enough value or interest for my audience?
Annie, first of all, thank you for this question. I love that you're asking this question because knowing the answer to this question is actually a prerequisite for the question most podcasters are asking, which is, how do I reach more listeners and grow my podcast? So if you know the answer to this first, then it's going to make the podcast growth piece and the building of the podcast growth strategy so much easier. So if you are listening to this podcast because you either want to launch a show that actually gets listened to, or because you have a podcast that just hasn't grown in the way you've expected it yet, even if you've seen some growth, we have people that come on our workshops and they're like, look, I'm seeing some traction. I'm getting some clients from the show. I've been doing this. I love the process of podcasting, but I'm still not where I want to be yet. And then there are other people who are like, I've been doing this for 2 years and I'm still getting less than 30 downloads an episode and I don't know what to do differently. So if you identify on either side of that spectrum, you're launching a podcast, you want to grow your podcast, pay close attention, because understanding how to actually deliver value, which we covered in the previous episode, and how to measure whether listeners actually find your show valuable is one of the key skills that you need to develop if you want to be a top podcast host. So if you didn't catch the episode before this, I encourage you to pause this one and go listen to that, because then when you come back to this one, you're going to see exactly how these things go together, because they really are two sides of the same coin. So when it comes to measuring the value that you're giving on your show, there's actually 4 things you can look at that determine whether your content holds enough value, i.e. interest, for your audience. So let's take a look at what each of these are at a high level, and then we're going to break each one down. Okay, so here are the 4 signs. Number 1, listener retention. Number 2, specific, thoughtful feedback. Number 3, your listeners are taking action. And number 4, your podcast is generating conversions, sales conversations, or revenue opportunities. Before we get deeper into these 4 signs, we got to understand the difference between qualitative versus quantitative data. Because some of these signs are qualitative. They're not going to be things that we can measure with a number. Some of these are things we can measure with a number, and therefore they're quantitative. Both are important though, because let's say your podcast gets 5,000 downloads this month. That's quantitative data. It tells you the number of listens you got on your show, but it doesn't tell you the characteristics of those listeners. It doesn't tell you how those episodes, or which episodes even, actually impacted people, or what was it that you said exactly in that episode that impacted someone. So this is why you also need qualitative data. Because let's say you get a whole bunch of listener reviews and people are saying things like, gosh, your podcast finally gave me the confidence to do XYZ, or I binge listened to 10 episodes in a row, it's that good, or I love how you break down complex ideas and you make them so easy to apply. All things I'm sure you would love to hear about your podcast. All of that is qualitative data. It tells you how those 5,000 downloads are actually impacting people. So here's the distinction you need to make in your mind. First, quantitative, which are the things you can count and measure, will tell you things like how many people pressed play, or how many people see your cover art and actually are clicking through to see more of your show, or how long someone listened to your show, which all can be very useful information. But the qualitative is going to give context to those numbers. It's going to tell you why those plays matter and how they're making an impact. And arguably, I love the qualitative piece of it. I find it's more useful. It's definitely more personally satisfying, and it helps give that context to numbers that otherwise really don't mean a whole lot of anything to any of us on its own, especially for those of us who are here who have a podcast, because we're looking to make a meaningful difference in the world. So let's dive into the 2 quantitative things to be looking at that you can easily measure to determine whether your content is providing value. And then we'll look at the qualitative side of that to give context to these numbers. So the first is listener retention. This is the easiest one to start with. It's also one that's been getting a lot more attention in the podcasting space, and for good reason. Because a download really doesn't tell you a whole lot. But if you can see how long a listener is listening to your show on average, if they're sticking around for the full episode, if they're dropping off early, then that could be an indicator into the quality of your content, whether or not they're actually getting value from the show. So high listener retention means your episodes are valuable enough to keep them listening. I have a good friend of mine in this space, Seth Silvers. He is the founder of Story on Media, and he's actually the strategist behind the Hormozy podcasts. I'm going to link to his episodes in the show notes below. He has a brilliant formula for determining your ideal listener retention benchmark. So you take 100%, you subtract the length of your episode, and that equals your ideal listener retention. So industry-wide as a benchmark, usually we look at listener retention, we want to see a minimum of 65%. In my opinion, that's a little low, but a minimum of 65%. But that doesn't really take into account whether, if you've got an hour and a half long episode, or if you're dropping 5-minute short little nugget-sized episodes on your podcast, then that's really going to skew the listener retention. Because if you've got a 5-minute episode, chances are more people are going to get to the end of that episode than a 90-minute episode. So taking this formula, 100% minus the length of your episode, the average length of your episode, gives you your ideal listener retention benchmark. So for me, my average episode length is 20 minutes. So if I take 100 minus 20, then 80% would be my ideal listener retention benchmark. Yours might be a little different. Do the math. Figure out what it is. The way you're going to track this is you're going to go into Apple Podcasts Connect, your Apple Podcast dashboard, and you're going to take the last 10 episodes and you're going to look at how long were those episodes, add them up, find the average length, and then you're going to add up the retention for those episodes. They call it consumption. Add it up, get the average, and notice where your retention is based on that formula. This is where you're going to want to start. When it comes to actually figuring out, is my podcast providing value? We want to look here at listener retention because this one is going to drive the other 3 signs that we're about to dig into. Plus, if you're doing any marketing or any promotion for your podcast right now, all of those efforts are going to go to waste if you don't fix this. Because what this means is essentially, an easy metaphor for this is to think of your podcast like a bucket. And if you've got holes in the bucket and listeners are not sticking around, it's going to be very difficult to grow an audience. So I'm going to link to a couple episodes in the show notes to help you improve your listener retention if it is lower than where you want to be. And then you want to look at your individual episodes too. And notice the drop-off points. Compare your episodes to each other. And this works both ways. If you have high retention rates, see if you can notice trends as to why. And if you have low retention rates, see if you can spot the trends as to why. Now, listener retention is just one data point. It doesn't paint the whole picture, but it's where you want to start. The next place you want to look, which is also quantitative, is whether your listeners are taking action. And by action, it can mean a number of things. Joining your email list, booking a sales call, filling out an application, downloading a lead magnet, engaging with whatever your call to action is. If you've got affiliates, making an affiliate purchase. If you've got a sponsor, making a purchase with a sponsor. You want to be tracking this, whether it be through custom URLs or UTM tracking. If you're unfamiliar with UTM tracking, you have ChatGPT or good old Google to help walk you through it. But you want to be tracking attribution. This is a fancy term that we in the industry use, okay, to sound smart. Attribution, all it really means is you want to figure out if the activity that's happening in your business, on your email list, et cetera, can be attributed to or linked back to the work that you're doing on the podcast. Because then you'll have confirmation that work you're doing on the podcast is actually working. So we track, first and foremost, whether our podcast-related calls to actions are actually driving signups. Are they actually driving registrations to the webinar? Are they actually driving leads into the business? We actually look at mentions of the podcast in all of our intake forms, pod launch applications, on sales calls. And it's a very reassuring stat because I can review our monthly KPIs in the business and see, oh yeah, we had 30 signups this month direct from the podcast. Or literally every single person who filled out an application for the program this month mentioned the podcast. So if you're tracking opt-ins, if you're tracking email signups, if you're tracking applications, registrations, and all those things and you're seeing no movement, could be a listener retention problem. Because if listeners are not getting to the end of the episode and your calls to actions are at the end of the episode, well, they're not hearing it. Or it could be that your calls to actions might need some tweaking. Maybe it needs to be clearer. Maybe it needs to be more specific. Maybe you're giving too many different calls to actions. I get this question a lot. In fact, one of our coaching calls just a week or two ago, a client asked, well, what types of calls to action should I be giving? How many lead magnets should I have? We went into this whole thing about the simpler you can make it, the better. If you can have one point of entry to get people onto your email list, which is usually the best next step because then you can nurture them from there. That can lead to sales from there. That's someone raising their hand and saying, I want more from you. So that's how you as a host know that you've got an engaged listener. So when thinking of your calls to actions, don't be trying to create lead magnets just to match it to your episode and this and that. I used to do that. Oh my gosh, it was so much work. I burn out so fast. What I have now is one natural next step. And I don't even say it in every episode. But if you listen to the show for a long time, you've probably heard me mention the live workshop that I teach on average once a month. If you love what you hear here on the show, you are absolutely going to love that workshop. I have no doubt in my mind. In fact, a lot of people who listen to the show come to the workshop and it takes everything you're learning here to the next level. It's free. I teach it once a month. There's a link in the show notes. So those kinds of calls to actions, and then be tracking the action that your people are taking. So those two things, listener retention and actually tracking whether your listeners are taking action, those are some specific measurable things that we can look at as podcast hosts to see, yeah, people are getting value from this. But I want to talk about a couple of other ways here to measure impact, and it's the qualitative side of this. So the first would be that you're getting specific, thoughtful feedback, because most of the time, people will not take time out of their day to write a review that says, great show with a thumbs up emoji. Where's the value in that for anyone? But when you get a review that says, what you said in episode such and such made an impact for me and here's what it changed for me. Or I found your podcast through a Google search looking for something else. And I started listening and now I'm averaging 2 to 3 of your episodes every day. I can't get enough. Detailed feedback is a very valuable way to measure impact. So new positive ratings on your show, new positive reviews on your show. You should be getting these monthly because this is a great indicator that your content is really helping people. Now, if you're not getting those monthly, don't panic. I know it can be a point of frustration. There were months where my podcast would go and I was like, there's no new reviews and I'm asking for the reviews. I'm like, nobody's leaving the reviews. And I was like, you people, you don't take time to leave reviews. Now we get all bent out of shape about it. But at the end of the day, it was my content that wasn't valuable. My content wasn't moving people to leave a review. The fun thing with reviews is you can actually go to your competitor podcasts. In fact, I recommend doing this. You can look at the 1-star, the 2-star, and 3-star reviews on other podcasts and see what drove those listeners so bonkers that they actually took a minute of their day to write about it. And then make sure never to do that on your show. Something else you could do is notice the reviews and even beyond reviews, the DMs, the conversations you have in person, and the social media comments that you get that repeat key phrases from your episodes. Your show is helping me do XYZ, or what specific content may be resonating. And you can ask direct questions in your episodes to tell listeners how to engage. Now, look, if this helped you, come find me on Instagram at your handle and send me a DM. Let me know what your biggest takeaway was. Or come connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to get to know you better. Let me know how the show is helping you and let me know what else I might be able to do or cover here on the show that would help you too. So again, this is qualitative. This is not something that we can easily assign a number to. I mean, I guess you technically could say, I want a benchmark goal of having 2 new reviews a month. But overall, what I would rather you focus on is look at the content of those reviews. Look at the content of those conversations that you're having and what people are saying about your show. The more specific and the more thoughtful and the more direct that feedback is, that is one surefire way to know that you are giving value. The other qualitative way to look at how are my listeners receiving the content that I'm sharing, are they finding it valuable, is if your podcast is generating sales conversations or opening up any type of new revenue generating opportunity for you. Because you might be listening right now because you've got a business behind the podcast and the podcast needs to drive leads into that business. That's the goal. Or you might be listening because you're a professional. You've got another type of career that you're a doctor, you're a real estate professional. But the podcast is meant to build your authority and grow your audience so that you can eventually monetize that audience through sponsors. So another thing you can measure that is a very clear sign if you're delivering value to the right audience is number 1, if your show is generating sales conversations, if you've got a business, or if it's opening up new revenue opportunities, speaking opportunities, collaboration, sponsor deals, so on and so forth. So we literally have embedded in all of our opt-in forms, do you listen to the podcast? Yes or no? Or making a point whenever you have a sales conversation with someone to ask, how did you hear about us? Do you listen to the podcast? Have you heard an episode? And then track on how many discovery calls people mention your podcast as the reason that they booked. That's a little bit qualitative. It's a little bit quantitative because you can measure, hey, we had 30 people opt in and say, yes, they listened to the podcast this month. That's great. But it's also a little bit qualitative because if you are in those conversations, you can pay attention to what prospects are saying. Are they referencing specific episodes? Are they sharing specific insights on calls? I was in the DMs one day with someone and they were like, I wanted to be mad at your workshop when you said you're stuck in less than 200 download per episode jail. But it was so specific and it was so accurate and it so described exactly where I am and the frustration I'm feeling with my podcast that I couldn't be mad. I was grateful. Those kinds of things. And even if you're not selling anything specifically, you don't have an offer, quote unquote, that you are driving people to, your podcast can still open doors for you. What kind of guests are saying yes to being on your show? Are people inviting you to speak on stages, wherever, around the world, in your country, wherever that might be? Are industry peers reaching out to collaborate? Are you being quoted or referenced in other conversations, whether that be online or offline? What kind of networking connections came from your podcast? Maybe guests that you invited on that later turned into really valuable collaborations or really valuable sales conversations. So these are the 4 things. Listener retention. Are people staying tuned in? Are they taking action? So are they engaging with you beyond listening to the episode itself? Are you getting specific, thoughtful feedback? And are they telling you exactly how your content is helping them? And is your podcast generating sales conversations or creating new opportunities for you? Is it leading to meaningful connections or invitations that wouldn't have come through otherwise, or industry recognition that you probably wouldn't have gotten were it not for your podcast? Now, before we wrap this up though, I want you to be very aware of 4 traps that are easy to fall into. The first is this: if my podcast is valuable, then that means I should see results immediately. The reality is it takes time for a podcast to build traction, even when you have the right messaging and positioning in place. And it'll take even longer when you don't have a strategic podcast marketing plan in place and when you don't have that messaging in place. And I'll be honest, with my show, it wasn't until I got hyper specific with my message and the problems that I solve that I really started seeing the results from the podcast. And that was 3.5 years into my podcast. So the sooner you can be specific, the better. Also, another easy trap to fall into is this idea of thinking, well, more downloads means that I'm giving more value. High downloads don't always mean high impact. In fact, a download doesn't tell us how long someone listened to the show. If you look on Spotify, in your Spotify for Creators dashboard, it literally says if they listened for 0 seconds or more. Wait a minute, you're counting that and it's like, they didn't even listen, for half a second? So numbers, yes, are kind of the go-to for measuring success, but they're not always the best metric. They don't tell us enough. So don't discount that qualitative data, especially early on in the game, because you don't need a huge audience before your podcast can start creating opportunities for you. In fact, for many podcasts, and for a lot of the people we work with, a smaller niche audience of right listeners can generate more high-value connections that then lead to other opportunities. Another easy trap to fall into is this idea that, well, if people aren't commenting, or if they're not DMing me, or if they're not sharing my show, or they're not tagging me, they're not leaving reviews, like my podcast isn't working. Here's the thing. Not everyone vocalizes their engagement. Sometimes I listen to stuff and I love it, and it just doesn't even cross my mind to leave a review because guess what? I was listening on the way to school to pick up my son, and then it was like, oh, I had to pick him up, and now I'm like in mom mode, and I didn't even think to go back to it. Sometimes I get new reviews simply by asking someone who told me something nice about the show online somewhere. Maybe they DM'd me or we were chatting in the comments somewhere. And I was like, you know what? Would you be willing to write that in a review to help other listeners know that this show is worth their time too? No one has ever told me no when I have asked them that. They've always said yes, and they're happy to do it. So this is why you want to have a multifaceted approach to tracking, because numbers don't tell the full story. And then the fourth and final trap that is very easy to fall into is this idea that, well, if my podcast isn't leading to direct conversions or direct revenue, then it's failing. Here's what you and I both already know to be true. It takes time to build trust. You're not going to go on a first date with someone and marry him the next day. At least I hope you wouldn't. Maybe if you were drunk in Vegas or something, you might. But those scenarios aside, it takes time to trust someone. Some listeners might listen for months or years before reaching out. I've had it happen. I have had people who have come to me when they were thinking of launching a podcast and then decide they're going to go do it on their own. They're going to figure it out. They've got this. They can figure it out. And then a year or more later come back and say, I shouldn't have done that. I should have listened to you. Can we work together because I need your help? So you have to know this is a long play. So instead of being so focused on like, am I getting revenue? And I know it costs money to run a podcast. I get it. Believe me. But you already are podcasting. So you know this is a long game. So focus on mastering your craft. and trust that those results are going to come. It's hard to do. Believe me, it's hard to do when you sometimes are putting in that work every single day. But when you have a strategy and when you know your messaging is clear, then it's only a matter of time before that compounding effect kicks in and you start seeing ROI from your podcast. I promise you, because I've done it both ways. I've had a podcast that was very general, very broad, and very vague, and then a podcast that was very specific and very dialed in for a very specific person. And I can tell you from experience. So, where to start? If you're walking away from this episode and you're like, okay, I have a lot to think about now. This is great. This is helping me. This was valuable. I never thought about these things. What I would recommend to you, the very first thing you need to do, as soon as you can get to your laptop, go look up your average listener retention. This is going to be your first clue. Everything else follows from here. So when you get your retention right, which go back to the previous episode if you haven't listened to learn how to provide value in your content so that we can keep listeners listening and keep them listening longer. See those retention rates go up and then layer in from there. So if you loved this episode, I would love it if you would take 10 seconds, 30 seconds, go tap the 5 stars on Apple, on Spotify, bonus points when you leave a written review on Apple so that other podcasters and aspiring podcasters can see how helpful this show is for you so that they can get the same value from it too. And then don't go anywhere because in the next episode, I'm excited for this one. We are talking about a topic that is not covered enough in podcasting land, which is how to keep people from stealing the hard work that you're doing on your podcast. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.